I guess slowly you learn, hopefully, that you are in there and that you have got all that capacity. And it's a matter of a bag of tricks to try to stop all the sabotage. The skill for me is being able to functionally navigate that dream state in ways that facilitate it letting out brilliance. Autism is a fruit salad. Everyone's fruit salad is different. If you want to be empowered, you need to work out your own fruit salad and what makes each of those parts tick and what are their best strategies and adaptations. And that will give you advocacy for those things. Instead of saying, oh, it's all my autism. Let's dissect it and say it's this part of my autism, it's this part, it's that part, and they've got their own little names. And yeah, because otherwise we expect everyone to be one size fits all, and we're not. For me, and everyone's, like, if you say, tell us about stimming, tell us about this, every person's reason is coming from their fruit salad. So when you say about pronouns, my reasons will come from my fruit salad, Barb's reasons will come from her fruit salad. So I can talk about what's coming from mine. But as an autism consultant who worked with over 1,000 people with autism, I can also say I've seen other reasons why it will come out in other people. In my case, there were a number of things going on. The inability to process a simultaneous sense of self and other. This means that when you get other, you lose self. You still record everything they're saying, but you can't work out what you think or feel about any of it. And then when you get into self, you lose track of other. They're an impression, they're doing stuff, but it means nothing. And it's not in relation to you, even if they think it is. They're disappeared. You can only process this or this. But it's such an essential thing in the non-autistic world. So essential and so automatic and so easy that they have this I and you thing. And me in relation to you, and, you know, when you this, then I feel that. That's all language of simultaneous processing of self and other. I didn't achieve that till I was 35 years old. Each piece that goes in your fruit salad compounds the degree of what presents as your autism. And so, and that can be for good or bad. It can be, for example, that being extremely meaning deaf makes you a fabulous musician. It may be that being face blind makes you a great sculptor. It may be that seeing your world in bits makes you enormously sensory because you tune into the part because the whole does not exist. I wrote a book called Autism and Sensing, The Unlost Instinct, and that's the one about unknown knowing.
Yes.
And being able to trigger stuff from unknown knowing out in order for the conscious mind to be able to perceive it. And then there's books like Autism and Inside Out Approach, which is how to make your environment easier to process so that you're not shutting down all the time. How to make your environment easier to process so you can actually process you and another person at the same time.
As a child, people had thought her retarded or deaf. It turned out she was autistic. Peter Zosky invited her to be interviewed on Morningside about the book and about her life. The resulting conversation, which first aired in 1992, is an astonishing insight into the world of one autistic woman and into the power of the human spirit.
I grew up, and Barb relates to this, I grew up with really, really mad behavior, and not just mine. I mean, the people in my environment were crazier than me. Just surviving insane behavior, surviving torture, as in living with a psychopath who's a substance abuser and crazy, and bullying at school, and the segregation, that treating like, that's Donna, she's disturbed, that's Donna, she's psychotic, like go through the motions with her, but everyone else is a real child. And that stuff, it hurts your soul, it breaks your heart. When I went to that amusement park of life, There were locks on so many gates, and it's like the place had barbed wire and gates everywhere. And I just worked out, how can I cut that wire? How can I climb those gates? How can I bend those bars? How can I get a look in there? You know, I guess the modeling of non-autistic life and the fact that there were non-autistic people who had easy freedom and who had so much freedom that they didn't appreciate it because they hadn't had to really fight for it. And I guess that made me want to have the same degree of equality and inclusion and level of experiences and sense of individuality and personhood, to not drown in your condition. It's one thing to celebrate the parts of your condition that are well worth celebrating, but not everybody has an autism fruit salad that's all perfect and magical and genius and fantastic. There's no, even though exposure anxiety says, I can't do this, I've got to become a cat. You know, you say, well, I'm going to find a way to do this because I want to do this as fully as myself or not at all. But you do, if you're living with that chronic fight-flight, you've got to first observe it and understand it. 2, you've got to build the dictionary of how you're going to outwit it. 3rd, you've got to take charge of being the parent of it and teach it that you're actually the boss and it's actually an out of control mechanism, you know. And number 4, you say, this is the deal. I'm the person, you're the condition, and we're going to live on my terms. And if you're freaking out, we'll negotiate. I love it.
Think before you speak. Why can't you just talk to me? Why don't you pay attention? Why didn't you answer me? Look at me when I'm speaking to you. These are the sounds of ignorance, and they're everywhere. These are the sounds of nervous people in the face of difference. These are the sounds of people who can't make sense of the jam jar until it has a label. The label of this jam jar is autism. There's many components to autism. Autism is not one thing. It is an emotional hypersensitivity problem. It can be an information processing problem. It can be a total withdrawal into yourself where the whole world is replaced and made redundant, and you have every relationship with your own self that you could have with people in the world, and they don't matter anymore. Nobody nowhere is a person who lives in their own world, who has that social world in there where they make everything outside of themselves is redundant and all replaced in all self-contained. And to the point where it doesn't matter, there is no sense of where, and there is no sense of who. There just is. And that can be a nobody nowhere. And sometimes people live in there in fear, not in freedom. You can visit in freedom, but if you're compelled to live there, then you live there in fear. And that's the poem of Nobody Nowhere. In a room without windows, in the company of shadows, you know they won't forget you, they'll take you in. Emotionally shattered, don't ask if it mattered. Don't let that upset you, just start again. In a world under glass, you can watch the world pass and nobody can touch you. You think you're safe. But the wind can blow cold in the depths of your soul where you think nothing can hurt you till it's too late. Run till you drop. Do you know how to stop? All the people walk right past you. You wave goodbye. And they all merely smiled, for you looked like a child. Never thought that they'd upset you. They saw you cry. So take advice. Don't question the experts. Don't think twice, or you just might listen. Run and hide to the corners of your mind, alone, like a nobody nowhere. It says, in a room without windows. The room is the mind, and it has no windows. When you're that self-contained, you don't see out anymore. in the company of shadows is all those, the parent of yourself in yourself. You can't go and sit with these people. You can't really feel in life with these shadow people that's in you, in your relationship to yourself. That you took a whole world and create all those relationships in you. And says, you know they won't forget you, they'll take you in. So the hypnotism of it, the grab, the grip that turns you in there to go and be with shadows in a room without windows, is that when it's all turmoil out there, that has no turmoil in there, there will never be any rejection. There'll never be any looking for, is this all right? Do I fit in? Is everything safe? Because in there, there's none of that. You totally just go.
Yep.
A lot of people think that there's only one way of thinking, but I don't think that there's one way of thinking. I think that there's all different ways of thinking. And I think like if you had 3 people like these, and you look and you see, oh yeah, like that's a person. So then you assume that they've all got the same kind of thinking, but they're thinking that if this is the non-autistic person, they're like, if information comes into them, they can kind of like walk through life at a reasonable pace and take in the information and spit it back out. And this one I'd maybe call an autistic person. And him is kind of like a bit wobbly, and it's not so easy. Sometimes he can like deal with the information, and sometimes he just can't deal with it because it's too many different channels coming in all at once. And this one maybe will see the table, and it sees the lines and the colour, and it hears the sound, and it feels the surface, but maybe just thinks, oh yeah, that's that big square lines, flat thud thing. And maybe not go further and think, oh yeah, that equals table. And maybe not go further and think, oh yeah, that's for putting the things on. So then this one lives in the same world as this one. And when they look at each other, they sometimes don't see all this on them. So this one says, go put the dinner on the table. And all it is just all sounds. Because to him, he's weighed by this. He doesn't maybe always quickly make the sounds into then words, and the words then into the pictures, and the pictures then mean to do with the doing. It's not always just goes like that, just because it's for him, his thinking reality. So maybe he says, go put dinner on the table, and this one just stands there. He says, take the plate to the table, and he's just holding the plate. And he says, you must be stupid. You're not intelligent. I learned the different sounds that the things made. I learned the different textures that the things made. I learned the different sound back that told me if the things had bounce or if they didn't, how they impact that they bring back to you. And that was what I called the system of sensing. So I didn't need to interpret, and interpretation was, like, to me, redundant. So all the world of words is part of the system of interpretation. But then they kept insisting to use this system. Answer me with words. Look at me when I'm speaking to you. Go and do this. Come and do that. And always trying to make me go by a system that involves making meaning all the time. And this created in me a war. So I decided that the only safe place was inside of myself, because all this was foreign and invading.
Yep, makes so much sense. Trauma and abuse.
predispositions toward sensitivities. Fortune is not satisfied with inflicting one calamity. The question is this: are we to be controlled by accidents, by tyrants, or by ourselves? An anomalously high scorer on the HIS Trauma and Abuse TAB predisposition scale is likely to report various experiences of trauma throughout his/her life, as well as experiences of abuse in childhood. Trauma includes accidents, injuries, illnesses, and psychological shocks, e.g., being raped, seeing a loved one killed, being in a fire. Abuse includes sexual abuse, mental abuse, and abusive punishment. Trauma. Literature in the field of neurology posits that a history of trauma, as exemplified by automobile accidents, concussive head injuries, hospitalizations and surgeries, febrile illness, hypoxia, and childhood abuse, is frequently associated with temporal lobe epilepsy. Literature in the field of psychiatry posits that a history of childhood abuse, especially sexual abuse, is frequently associated with psychological dissociation. Literature in the field of transpersonal psychology posits that a history of childhood abuse, especially sexual abuse, is frequently associated with transpersonal experiences. Those who are sociologically oriented tend to consider childhood abuse, whether sexual, mental, or punishment, to be different from other types of trauma. Perhaps that is because it, more than the others, has obvious psychosocial underpinnings and is presumably therefore more amenable to therapeutic interventions. From a neurological perspective, specifically that of temporal lobe epilepsy, however, trauma is trauma. I agree. A childhood abuse is simply one subset of trauma. Psychological dissociation presumably involves altered state of consciousness, ASCs. As already mentioned, there are strong indications that ASCs are a key factor in transpersonal experiences, TPEs. The findings of correlations between trauma, including abuse, and dissociation on the one hand, and trauma, including abuse, and TPEs on the other, can easily lead one to conclude that trauma causes dissociation and that dissociation gives rise to TPEs. That may well be the case, but it does not necessarily follow from the data. Correlations, no matter how strong they might be, prove nothing about cause and effect. Establishing cause and effect requires that the researcher manipulate the independent variable, in this case the level of trauma, and given the ethical issues involved, it is unlikely that this was done in any of the published studies. Based on the available data, one could argue that transpersonal experiences cause dissociation and then make a case for dissociative behaviors, setting the stage for trauma and abuse perhaps by signaling a vulnerability. That explanation, seemingly blaming the victim as it does, is potentially incorrect and probably wrong as well, but there is nothing in the available data to suggest otherwise. Dissociation. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 4th edition, DSM-4, definition of dissociation is a disruption in the usually integrated functions of consciousness, memory, identity, or perception of the environment. Similarly, Bennett Brown, in his Basque model, defines dissociation as a process whereby an individual separates behaviors, affects, sensations, and/or knowledge from the mainstream of waking consciousness. Despite a warning in the DSM-4 that dissociative states are a common and accepted expression of cultural activities or religious experiences in many societies, and dissociation should not be considered inherently pathological, dissociation is generally assumed to be evidentiary of significant psychological problems. One author, for example, states, except when related to brain injury, dissociation always seems to be a response to traumatic life events. It's a survival response, of course. Given that the term dissociation is often used inappropriately to refer to any type of altered state of consciousness, of which there are many, that statement only serves to confound the issue. The potential stimuli for ASCs are multitudinous and varied. Trauma is just one of them. Despite the pathologizing spin frequently given to dissociation, Frank Putnam argues that it is both an intelligent and a creative survival strategy in that it serves to facilitate 7 major functions: automatization of certain behaviors, efficiency and economy of effort, resolution of irreconcilable conflicts, escape from the constraints of reality, isolation of catastrophic experiences, cathartic discharge of certain feelings, and enhancement of herd sense, e.g., the submersion of the individual ego for the group identity, great suggestibility. Dissociation as a defense mechanism becomes maladaptive and pathological only when the ability to discriminate between merely stressful stimuli and truly traumatic stimuli is lost. That is, when dissociation is mobilized unnecessarily as a disproportionately extreme response to stressors. One hazard using dissociation as a coping mechanism is that it is so effective, and those who dissociate often do not develop other useful defenses, such as denial, resistance, rationalization, or projection. Both Brown and Kluft, in their models of dissociative identity disorder, state that the dissociative defense mechanism is not available to everyone. Only about 25% of people in the general population have the inborn capacity to dissociate. since this is roughly the same percentage as those who are born with less strongly lateralized LSL brains, consideration should be given to the possibility that there might be a significant overlap between the two groups. Psychological dissociation can result in amnesia. Dissociative amnesia is different from the psychoanalytical concept of repression. Ernest Hilgard clarifies this distinction when he speaks of repression, in the Freudian sense, as being a horizontal barrier, in keeping with the metaphor of the unconscious being deeper, against unacceptable impulses, in contrast to the dissociative amnesic barrier, which is a vertical one, preventing the exchange of memories between different states of consciousness, SOCs, with potentially equal cognitive status. This amnesic process can be spoken of as state-dependent memory, meaning that an experience associated with one specific state of consciousness maintains that association over time, and that its availability to recall may be dependent on recreation of the same SOC in which the experience originally occurred. This association is exemplified by the drunk, who, when sober, is unable to recall his intoxicated behavior, but when again intoxicated, is then able to do so. This separation of behavior, affect, sensation, or knowledge from the mainstream of waking consciousness presumably means that what has been separated, dissociated, has been relegated to the subconscious mind. That being the case, the subconscious mind appears to be just another name for amnesia. The subconscious mind then is appropriately thought of not as a static thing, but as a dynamic process, one that potentially involves any state of consciousness other than ordinary waking consciousness. Since experience is state-dependent, and since there is at least some degree of amnesia between ordinary waking consciousness and all other states of consciousness, it follows that an individual does not have just one subconscious mind, but has as many subconscious minds as there are possible SOCs, presumably an infinitude. It follows as well that different people will have different degrees of barrier permeability between their various states of consciousness. That is, in the general population, proneness to dissociation will be spread out over a continuum. Finally, heightened proneness to dissociation, having been characterized as a heightened sensitivity to stressors, it follows that dissociation proneness, more generally sensitivity to altered states of consciousness, and sensitivity to transpersonal experiences are likely to go hand in hand.
I remember my first dream, or at least the first that I can recall. I was moving through white, with no objects, just white, and bright spots of fluffy colour surrounded me everywhere. I passed through them and they passed through me. It was the sort of thing that made me laugh. This dream came before any others with shit or monsters or people in them, and certainly before I noticed the difference between the three. I must have been less than 3 years old, and the dream depicted the nature of my world at that time. Awake, I pursued the dream relentlessly. I'd face the light shining through the window next to my cot and rub my eyes furiously. There they were, the bright, fluffy colours moving through the white. Stop that, came the intrusive garble, and I'd continue merrily. Slap. I discovered the air was full of spots. If you looked into the nothingness, there were spots. People could walk by, obstructing the magical view of nothingness. I'd move past them. They'd garble. Gabble. My attention would be firmly set on my desire to lose myself in the spots. I'd ignore the gabble and look straight through this obstruction with calm expression, soothed by being lost in the spots. Slap. I was learning about the world. I learned eventually to lose myself in anything I desired. The patterns on the wallpaper or the carpet, the sound of something over and over again, like the hollow thud I get from tapping my chin. Even people became no problem. Their words became a mumbling jumble, and their voices a pattern of sounds. I could look through them until I wasn't there, and then later I'd learn to lose myself in them. Words were no problem, but other people's expectations for me to respond to them were. This would have required my understanding what was said, but I was too happy losing myself to want to be dragged back by something as two-dimensional as understanding.
That's Donna Williams, as I say, reading. And it may be worth remembering as you come to know her better. Our conversations fills most of Morningside's first hour today. The apparent ease and comfort with which she can bring her own words and visions off the printed page. At one point in a meeting Donna and I had before the exchange we're playing this morning, in fact, and if I may for a moment leap ahead of the story here, I grew frustrated with my own inability to speak to her so she could understand me, to talk so she could sort out my thoughts from the mumbling jumble that speech often represents to her, and, excusing myself, went down the hall to my typewriter and banged out what was in fact a letter to her. When I returned, she perused it for a while and then, somewhat to my embarrassment, read it aloud, with, obviously, total comprehension. As you'll hear her say later this morning, she is the opposite of illiterate. For her, the written word, sometimes even her own, is the key to freedom. It's speech, and sometimes sight and hearing too, that is the prison. The dictionary definitions of autism, which tend to talk of self-absorption, even morbid absorption in the case of the concise Oxford, are not helpful.
It's, for me, emotions are the difference between to appear and to be, and I would prefer to be.
What does the word lonely mean to you?
Lonely. One thing about lonely is it's very hard to recognize lonely when the first response to lonely is to disappear in something else. Once you have disappeared into something else, you are oblivious to everything and yourself. So where is lonely? Lonely's gone. When you become a spot on the wall, when you can't find you, you're so absorbed in that. There's no lonely. The processing of lonely doesn't happen that easily. I think it's also very hard to be lonely when I feel part of things, like the spot on the wall, like a bright coloured light. It translates so quickly from lonely into being caught up in the sensory experience of something. And it's such a place of no interpretation that lonely often doesn't happen. Alone happens when I am away from my emotions, or I am away from being able to get lost in different things. Then I feel alone, but I'm not sure I'm lonely.